The unveiling of the company of heaven. Every man and every woman is a star.
Hello, everyone, and welcome yet again to the Free Radical Media Podcast. I am one of your co-hosts, Eric Scott Picard, joined as ever by the intrepid Patrick Ryan.
How's it going, everyone?
We've got a real fun show for you tonight. We've been looking forward to this show actually for a few weeks. We're really happy to be able to bring it to you. You may have noticed we focused a lot on herbalism. And alternative medicine and things of that nature in the past month or so. This episode's going to kind of culminate all of that. We've got Stephen Buhner. Stephen is a earth poet, herbalist, naturalist, and award-winning author of over 20 books on nature, indigenous cultures, the environment, and herbal medicine. He's been working especially lately on herbal treatments for Lyme disease, some of which we'll get into a little bit later, possibly. Some of his recent books include Plant Intelligence in the Imaginal Realm, Healing Lyme Co-Infections, and Herbal Antivirals, Natural Treatments for Emerging Viral Infections. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome you to the show, Stephen.
Hey, great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been excited about it. We really have been. Usually I start things off, I like to ask guests, what was the zeitgeist of getting into the things that you do, right? So I was looking at your bio. It looks like you studied under some pretty interesting people. So how did you come to become interested in this kind of field of study?
I didn't really fit into the boxes of life, and that became pretty clear to me early on. I mean, the schooling system in the United States, I think, is really deplorable, and for any children that have a real active imagination and a lot of energy and interest in the world, it's fairly stifling. And so, basically, at the end of grade, I was asked to leave high school and never return, and it was probably one of the best things that happened to me. And so luckily it was the 60s, and a lot of interesting things were happening. So I immediately left Dallas, Texas, which all people should do, and went to Berkeley, San Francisco area and hung out and met a lot of fascinating people. And I took a GED and started to college, and it was just really fascinating to me to be able to pick whatever I wanted to study. And then I started meeting some really interesting people. I ended up a number of years later in the mountains of Colorado, where I built this little turn-of-the-century cabin and lived there without any amenities, except for the wildness of nature. And I had this great teacher named Ben Sweet, who was an astonishing guy, and I decided I wanted all of my teachers to be like that. So basically, about that time, I made a list of everybody that had moved me and that I wanted to learn from. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, Buckminster Fuller, and on and on and on. And then I made it a real point to go. I actually designed a external degree program where I could go study with all of these people. And I just kept studying with them once I was done. I considered there's so many fascinating people doing the most amazing things. I mean, it's like we read books, we hear about Alan Turing or the great German poet Goethe, or all of these people. The thing is, there's people like that alive all around us today. And I thought, why settle for second-rate, third-best stuff in college when I could just go study with all these people in person? And so I just have continued through my life for many years to make a list of all of these fascinating people and went and studied with them personally, and the ones that were dead I read intensively in their work, and I sort of then began to find what my life was meant to do. There's no way I was going to fit into any of the employment boxes of life either, and as a result, it's been kind of an amazing, magical journey for a very long time.
Yeah, it living in that manner, it definitely is a beautiful little journey, especially I don't think a lot of the people listening, certainly not Patrick and myself, we don't really fit into those boxes either. I think increasingly a lot of people are realizing that they don't fit into those boxes.
Well, that's really true. I mean, I worked for 12 or 13 years as a psychotherapist, and I remember this guy who came to us, and he was in our group therapy sessions, and he had worked for 28 years for IBM, and they laid him off 18 months before his retirement, right? He was 56. He didn't have any idea what to do. He didn't know how to do anything except for send out resumes or whatever. He was completely trapped. And the businesses in America did until about 1980, when it really began to change. By 1990, it was really history. They had a contract with their employees. You give us your life and we'll give you this pension, And all of that changed. And so all of the people that had sort of just gone through the regular employment dynamic found out that they were just sort of out of luck. And, that thing it's more difficult to create your kind of life journey that you want to, that's based on who you are and what you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And to find a way to make a living doing it, it's very, very difficult, unless you win the writing lottery like Stephen King did. His first book made $400,000, so that was back in the 70s, and he never looked back. But the thing is, most people, that's not what happens, and it's a long, slow, incremental slog toward minimum wage, but sooner or later, it really does begin to all come together, and once it does, there's this kind of empowerment that happens because you aren't dependent on some corporation or the sort of typical employment thing. It comes out of your own drive, your own genius, your own feeling of what you need to do, and although it's a much more difficult road in the long run, I think it's a lot more sustainable economically for everybody.
Right. I know the philosopher Terence McKenna once said, if you jump into the abyss, you'll find out that on the other end is a bed of feathers, and it's like almost like
feathers. Yeah, I wouldn't call Terence a philosopher, though. I understand some people do. I mean, that was an incredibly outrageous person, and Bucky Fuller used to say, if you do what you're meant to do, the making a living will take care of itself. And yeah, that's true, but the part he left out is you have to work like 60 to 90 hours a week to make it happen that way. And yeah, and so by the time you hit 62, like I'm at, I'm like, yeah, I can maybe do 25 hours this week. I don't think I can do that stuff anymore. So yeah, they leave out the hard parts, but yeah, you can do it. And yeah, there is a bed of feathers there, eventually.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny because, the whole, you'll hear people that are really sort of subscribed to the capitalist consumerist paradigm, and they'll say, well, they have this perspective of, the cream always rises to the top. Like the people.
So does feces. The stuff really flows.
Exactly.
I mean, it's so true. It's like, and it's like, well, you look at some of these economically rundown neighborhoods or parts of cities, and I always wonder, it's like, how many Leonardo da Vinci's live in these neighborhoods, or Einsteins live in these neighborhoods. That
there's a lot of them. There's that's one of the things about. See, I'm a real Jeffersonian. I love the original vision that was developed then, and they really believed that there should be very little regulation of the American economy. I mean, that was the great innovation, that anybody could do anything they wanted and nobody could prohibit it. There was no licensure, there was no, inspections, there was no certification, none of that. Anybody could do whatever they wanted, and it was a completely outrageous concept. I mean, if you mention that to people now, they'll still think it's outrageous, because they'll start going, well, what about safety, and what about this, what about that? And the original concept was the benefits from doing it that way far outweigh any safety concerns that you might have, because it allows people's individual genius to really rise and develop and come into the world, and it makes the whole country a better place. And that was really true here until after World War II, when the United States became an imperial power, and slowly that changed. And with Reagan in 1980, it really accelerated away from that dynamic. And, it's just a tragedy, because a lot of people, they go into the school system, which is not prepared for genius. It's prepared for mediocrity. That's what it's designed for. So,
exactly.
The United States is becoming really, in many ways, a third world country because of the constraint on the innate intelligence and genius of the citizens here. The people that are in charge just don't want it. And, I know what that's like, because, I was born severely gifted, and that there's a reason why the severely gifted are under the intellectually disabled category. And they just, what they want is average, not great. So, but I believe in people's individual genius, and I think that's the one real hope that we have out of the predicament that we find ourselves in, because the solutions are never going to come from top down. It's going to be people on the ground coming up with these amazing things, and they go, hey, I wonder if, and that starts everything.
Right. It's you're absolutely right. I mean, our system, especially our educational system, is all designed around mediocrity. You have all these gateways that people have to move through, and if you don't have that certain disposition, or you don't play that game, you don't get anywhere. One of the best things my parents ever did, I was homeschooled. I would have went to an inner city school, underfunded, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And, I probably would have ended up on ADD medication.
Almost all boys do.
Exactly.
I mean, it's like, how dare you fidget in your seat? How dare you have energy? Take this pill, we'll feel better.
Right. Yeah. The pills are really for everyone else, right? But you're absolutely right. It's a system that's focused on producing, a very average product. It
is, and one of the things that fascinated me, that Ben Sweet sort of turned me on to all those years ago. I mean, the class, I only took one class from him, and it was called The Challenge of Being Human. And that changed everything. I thought, you mean you can focus on this? Oh, this is fascinating. And, all of the people I studied with, they were either independent scholars like Buckminster Fuller, who, he was thrown out of Harvard, or they were people like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who had gotten an MD degree in Europe. She was a young physician at the end of World War II, but she didn't fit in here. She was ostracized for much of her work. So all of the people that I studied with were real edgy, and they were really wanting to find unique solutions to the problems facing us without depending on the sort of established structure that was there, which it's not really geared toward finding solutions, especially if the problems we're facing are foundational to the structure that's in place, which is actually the case for a lot of the things we're dealing with now. So those people, they're just so interesting that they weren't only thinking out of the box, they didn't even know where the box was
right
50 years ago.
Right, right. It's almost like we're at this point now where it's almost more beneficial to you as an individual to spend some time unlearning rather than learning.
Well, that's a really good point. I mean, I've tried to convey that and I've gotten older and the more I've learned, when I've taught, the thing I've tried to emphasize more and more all the time is the degree of our ignorance, even myself, and I've trained myself to look for areas of ignorance. And nevertheless, they're extremely difficult to see and very difficult to eradicate. So the understanding that we're all fundamentally ignorant about the dynamics of the scenario in which we're embedded. As Buckminster Fuller said, we're not in a place, we're in a scenario.
Mm-hmm.
You can get out of a place, but you can't get out of a scenario. And once you understand it's a scenario that you're embedded within, and we can only see, for the most part, about 1% of what's going on here, not because we can't see more, but because we don't just stop to really look and notice the things that are right in front of us. And that's the hardest thing of all. To see what's right in front of us is the most difficult thing. So, and I find myself going on and on about that all the time, about being stuck about that. Like, when I was first training in herbal medicine, started over 30 years ago, I knew there were estrogenic plants that women could use as hormone replacement therapy, right? It took 15 years for me to ask the question, what about androgenic plants? I mean, nobody talked about them. Everybody knew about ginseng, but that's sort of an androgenic plant, but there are plants that contain testosterone, chemically identical to the testosterone in our bodies, but it had never been developed as a field in herbal medicine, not any place. And so when I finally asked the question, it opened up this whole field of understanding, not only about my own body and other male bodies, but about the way the whole ecosystem works, this fascinating blend of androgens and estrogens that are moving together through the landscape, basically through plants all of the time. And it just opened up this whole vision. But it took me 15 years to ask the question, and that's extremely common for nearly every human being in the Western world. It's very hard to ask the simple question, to see what we're not seeing.
Is it something you think that we've that we possessed once and lost? Because it seems like I talk to people, and in ancient times it seems like the shamans, the wise women, the midwives, they knew about using some of these things, right? Even accomplishing things that modern medicine, as you said, as hormone replacements, it seems like older societies knew about a lot of these things, and then at the advent of what we call modern medicine now, it got, I don't know, put in the shadows somehow.
Well, if you're looking at modern medicine in the Western world, especially, I mean, the United States medicine is the most conservative in the world, and they really don't get it. But if you start moving more into other cultures, it's never really stopped. The Chinese are looking at a blend of traditional herbal medicine as well as pharmaceutical technological medicine. I mean, they're going to be eating our lunch for a long time because we're still hooked into this, oh no, that's superstitious nonsense, But in medicine, there's that one thing. But, to back up a little bit, the real key to all of this is being able to have that wonder and sense of awe that we had as children, where we're asking, because kids ask those questions all of the time. I mean, I remember asking this question when I was a kid, hey, Mom, do cows in France moo different than cows in America? And she goes, oh, no, honey, cows moo all the same. Well, it turns out, of course, cows in France do moo differently than cows in the United States. Cows, every organism that's in some, location where it's sort of endemic there and has been there, descended for a long time from other organisms like itself, they all have a slightly different linguistic. Birds probably least because they travel so much. But another question I remember is, Mom, are hot dogs made from dogs? Oh, no, honey. Hot dogs were never made from dogs. Well, actually, hot dogs were made from dogs in the 19th century in New York. There was a new company that went into town, and it started gathering up all of the stray dogs and turning them into sausages, because they could sell their dogs cheaper. And so a columnist, an investigative reporter, found out about this and wrote this article, and he's going, get your hot dogs now. And that's where it came from. So, the way that we're kind of put off as children to these very fascinating and important questions, it begins to circumvent our natural wonder. And by the time we get into school, it's really compressed a lot because we're put into an hour here, an hour there, and all of that stuff. But the way we learn as children is something catches our fascination, our interest, and we totally are absorbed into it, and we spend as much time in it as we need to get whatever is there for us. And then we're done, and we go on to something else. And that's normal learning. So it's really the suppression of the natural wonder of the child. I mean, we're taught we have to grow up, and if we want to remain childlike and young like that, we're considered naive, unsophisticated, and really kind of stupid, But nevertheless, if you look at people like Helen Keller, Barbara McClintock, Albert Einstein, Luther Burbank, all the people I admired, Goethe, they all remained childlike with that sense of wonder to the day that they died. And that's really the key, because that allows you to see the things you're not seeing, to ask the questions that are simple and obvious, from which these fascinating answers come, and the whole world begins to change. We begin to make genuine contributions that are unique to our time, that come from us in a unique way, and that's what we need now. We don't need a bunch of more people from Harvard telling us how to live our life or how to recycle.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
It's funny. I had a buddy recently. He's just now deciding to go to college, which he's 27 years old, and I was like, I first of all told him don't do it.
Yeah.
But after that, I said, well, what are you going for? And he says, oh, I'm going for finance. And I'm just like, and I started talking about capitalism with him and, our economic system. And it boggles my mind how few people question that there's another way to do, or any other potential way to do commerce. We've talked about, and this is just an example of what you were going on. We've talked about this before on the show, like, for example, in economics classes, I remember them teaching us, well, prior to money, we did bartering, and that's how these indigenous societies worked, and money was just invented to make bartering easier, essentially. And that's just flat out not true. Just a total people rewriting history to sort of fit the current paradigm. And to me, it's like, even a lot of these skeptic type people who debunk everything won't turn their eyes towards something like capitalism and say,
the skeptics, I'll tell you one thing about skeptics. The one thing they're not skeptical of is their own skepticism. So therefore, they're not really skeptics. They're ideologues, demagogues hooked into their own framework. But the thing about capitalism is there's different kinds, entrepreneurial capitalism from individual people, which is more the Jeffersonian ideal of people that develop skills and then they, sell it in the marketplace, and other people doing the same thing. It's very different from corporate capitalism, and even then, they were having massive fights about which should control the United States framework, and it was really the corporate capitalism that sort of won out over time. But that's not really the original vision, and in that dynamic, corporate capitalism is in general dangerous to all life forms, and there's no way that's ever going to change it. It's been true all through history, and we do have a lot of other options, but We don't really have the freedom to explore those options.
And that's just it. It's the ability to first of all see and then to explore options. And you're right, it's very difficult for people to really recognize these things. I don't know. I mean, what would you say causes someone like yourself to pursue these other options? Like, what is the catalyst that really makes you go, wait a minute, I don't want to be part of this herd. I want to look into the alternatives. I want to see what else is out there. What do you think separates those types of people from the masses?
I've asked myself that question for a very long time, and I don't really have an easy answer. The one thing I know that's different, I mean, there's probably two aspects to it. I mean, you all have met 2-year-olds before, haven't you? 2-year-old children don't like to have limits set on their behavior. And normally what happens is they get sort of suppressed and forced to obey. And later, about age 16, that whole 2-year-old dynamic recycles itself. And that's why you get all of that outrageous behavior in 16-year-olds. For me, that part of me that says, no, I won't, and you can't make me, was very strong. When it reemerged at age 16, I was just not willing to ever put it back in the box. And I don't know why. Just tremendous stubbornness, a sense of the hypocrisy of the adults I was dealing with. I remember at the time looking at my parents and a lot of their friends and going, I don't want to end up like that. I don't want to be on my deathbed and look back at my life and go, I coulda. That's the one thing I refuse to do. I'm not going to do it. So that kind of stubborn kind of angry energy. And the other part of it that I find is common is, that people that have a sense, and I did from my teenage years on, the sense that there was something I was supposed to do. And every time I began to do anything, I analyzed what I was doing and compared it to what I felt I should be doing. And if it was real out of integrity with that, I wouldn't do it. And so it was kind of because I didn't want to just come to be in a place where I didn't have respect for myself. So I don't know why something makes one person make those choices and another person not. But for me, it was fundamental. I just couldn't do it. And all of the people that I admire and that I studied with, those same dynamics were present in them as well. And for whatever reason, there's a certain percentage of people in the culture that's just the way that they are, and end up being a real pain in the ass to the dominant paradigm, pretty much for their whole life. Sure.
I mean, even when you look in like indigenous cultures, if you study, the quote unquote medicine man or woman, they were typically, they lived on the peripheries. They weren't really in the thick of things in the sense that they were part of the group. A lot of them, even though they were very, it seemed that the indigenous people had an understanding that they were vitally important, but it seemed like they had one foot on the outskirts, so to speak.
Well, the difference with those between many of those cultures and our own is that they had a niche for people who had the capacity for different kinds of perceptual interaction with the scenario that we're in. And there was a recognized niche for those people. In our culture now, they're called artists or schizophrenics or drug addicts or whatever.
Exactly.
And they're kind of marginalized. And this is one of the few cultures that's ever existed that has marginalized those people this much. And, that's a difference. And I've spent many years studying the structures of different indigenous cultures. And, they've all got their shadow sides too. I mean, they had certain, the fundamental things that made them cool, in my opinion, was they had an absolute understanding, for the most part, that everything was alive and ensouled and intelligent and aware, that we were just part of the circle of life, not the dominant life form. And secondarily, they realized that visionary experience was essential for cultures to survive, and the people that had those kind of experiences were bringing in absolutely necessary understandings so that the culture could grow and endure. And those two differences, I think, are what make them attractive, because they had a lot of techniques that they developed over millennia to deal with those particular fundamentals that were part of their viewpoint. That's the one thing that's missing from our culture, and one of the things that's really impoverishing it and us. It's one of the major reasons why the Western cultures are so non-sustainable.
You know, that's the sickness within Western culture, I think, and I think it's the root cause of a lot of our problems. You know, it's loss.
The interesting thing is, you're right about that. There's, you know, I've created Buhner's axiom number 1, and you know, I'm working on exactly the best, you know, phrasing for it. But basically what it is that the most restrictive, reductive, psychologically damaged, afraid members of any movement will come over time to dominate that movement. So it doesn't matter whether it's vegetarianism, feminism, science, you know, it doesn't, or economics, it doesn't matter what it is. You have this movement toward that sort of dynamic. And what happened here is the Enlightenment, which was basically created as an alternative to the suppressive dynamics of Christianity in the West, it was very open, very incredible for a long time, but it slowly began to be taken over by that kind of group of people.
Yeah.
And the United States is the perfect example of it. You know, the most reductive, afraid, conservative, you know, limited viewpoint members of the scientific community ended up taking over that movement. And so we ended up with this weird materialistic reductionism that isn't really a very good reflection of the nature of the world, but yet it governs much of what our culture does and the way it treats the natural world. And it's literally insane, and we're really paying the price for it in increasing levels of yuck as time is going on.
Exactly. Yeah. And you're completely right about the reductionism. I mean, it seems like our society reduces a universe that is infinite in its complexity to a couple of simple black and white ideas. You know, I think it comes from kind of like the Platonic idealism. You know, there is one perfect chair, there is one perfect cow. They are all the same, and they should be treated the same, and there's nothing else to it, right? I mean,
well,
but it's very complex,
there's an element
you know.
of truth to that, as a matter of fact. But the thing that they left out is that as the archetype emerges into this scenario, into the three-dimensional space that we're in, it begins to change to match the ecological framework in which it emerges. So, yeah, deep in the core of the thing, there's that archetype, which was, you know, Plato called it the realm of the, you know, my brain went blank. I can't believe that I talk about this all the time. Anyway, the realm of the archai is what other Athenians might have called it, and the forms, and you know, and Aristotle understood much better that all of those moderate themselves as they move into our world. But you know, they try to look at the scenario that we're in, that the fundamental basics of it are mathematics, or physics, or chemistry. But really what's true, the fundamental here is self-organization. And once you understand that, everything changes, because self-organization is a thing that I was reading this, some guys that were writing about it the other day, and they're going, self-organization is the one thing that bedevils all of science today. You know, nature has an eerie yearning for order, And the root of the word eerie is quite interesting. It's like frightening, scary, and basically what it is, you get things that just all of a sudden self-organize. You get biological organisms that do that, and as soon as they do that, they become intelligent, aware, communicative, they develop tool use, all of these other things. It's an absolutely fascinating thing that I've written about it quite a lot, but that undermines the whole sort of reductionist materialistic paradigm that we're immersed in school from the day that we start. It's not really accurate. So life is a whole different deal. It's, as Frank Herbert once said, it's not a mystery to solve, but a reality to experience.
Right, right. And do you think that sort of emergence is coming out today in something like the form of the internet?
Well, the internet has got its own shadow side, and I remember when FM radio came out, and that was going to be just the coolest thing. I mean, there were no ads, and it was like podcasts, and now of course FM radio is like AM radio, and AM radio doesn't even exist anymore in any kind of usable form. And television, my telephone's become AM radio. I mean, I rarely get calls from people except they're trying to sell me something. So, the internet, the last thing the governments of the world want is a free internet. And after a while, they're going to find a way to control it. And, of course, people will be fighting against it. But I would suspect the same dynamics are going to occur with it as did with television and radio and everything else. And what will happen is the edgy people like you will find some other mechanism and forum through which to work. I mean, when the United States formed, it was tiny newspapers everywhere that anybody could, do and then circulate. So always it starts that way, then it gets controlled, then something else happens, it's really free, then it gets controlled, and a new one does. So for me, the real emergent dynamics that are happening are all of the fascinating people who don't think like the dominant paradigm, that are really aware something else is going on here, that won't settle for it, and they're coming up with all these amazing ideas. I mean, I look at all of the people in their 20s now, and they're so different than the way we were in the 60s. I mean, we didn't know anything. And, we were surviving this tremendous repression and trying to just find ourselves. And yeah, there's people still doing that, but I meet many, many people in that age range that are absolutely phenomenally aware and adept and are following these other paths. And there's literally thousands of them. Some of them are becoming herbalists, some are becoming permaculturists. I mean, they're doing all kinds of fascinating things. And that's the hope. Those people, that's the emergent property. It's not the mechanisms that they're going to use to get there. It's what they are themselves.
Yeah, I agree. Pat and I were exposed to a lot of people like that as well. Yeah, and I think it gives both of us kind of an optimism. I mean, I feel like we're in the process, this generation, of a kind of a collective awakening, a collective evolution. Culture isn't supposed to be stagnant. It's supposed to evolve just like everything else.
The cultures are supposed to, just like self-organized systems, they're supposed to remain close to the edge of chaos. If they get too far into chaos, they fall apart. But if they go too far away from that edge, they become static and unable to respond to change, and then they die as well. So they've got to remain really close to that. And that's part of the function of young people. I mean, the 60s were an exciting time. A lot of cool stuff happened then. And it really stirred everything up. And then the culture, as it always does, it goes through this massive conservative backlash against that and moves very far the other direction. And now it's starting to move back toward that edge of chaos where everything is stirred up again. And that's part of the function of the young in the human species, is that a lot of them don't have anything to lose, and they haven't been subjected to 40 years of getting the crap beat out of them by life. And so they're still very excited about it, and they're doing all this amazing stuff. And I see a lot of tremendous things happening now in that generation of people. And that's, it was really a relief to me when I was turned about 45, 46, and I began to notice that, because that's a young person's game. Burning up the world's a young person's game. My function now is kind of something different, and it just felt really good to pass that on to new generations and to let it go. And that's part of what we're supposed to do as we grow old. I mean, the young are supposed to kick our ass. They're supposed to keep us relevant, and I'm glad it's happened.
I mean, that's certainly what we both had in mind when we created Free Radical Media, was to act as a conduit for people with these quote-unquote radical ideas or revolutionary ideas, and to sort of propel them into the meme sphere and see, allow other people to experience them. And I agree with you. I mean, I'm a little jaded. I guess you could say I'm young. I'm still in my 20s. But, I look at what people in my generation are doing, and it definitely seems like there seems to be correlations between this generation and, the 60s, in the sense that I do see a reemergence in ecological type thinking, like permaculture, and alternative medicine. I see a reemergence in things like psychedelics. I feel like something like dimethyltryptamine or psilocybin mushrooms, or something that a lot of people in my age group are very open to and very keen on. And I personally, I think that's a good thing. I think that's a positive thing.
It's a really positive thing. I mean, most people, that's one of the things I deal with in plant intelligence in the imaginal realm, which is that, one of the real functions of psychotropics, which have been in the ecosystem for hundreds of millions of years. I mean, they must have been doing something all that time before the 60s, and what they do is that they alter the neural functioning of every organism. Every self-organized biological organism that ingests them has exactly the same experience that we do when we take them, and it allows the organism to more deeply access the metaphysical background of the world, and they get in touch with the meanings that we don't normally see, the things that are affecting everything, and then they begin to generate behaviors that are outside of their habituated parameters. And so you get tremendous new insight and tremendous innovation in behavior that allows culture of whatever sort, whether it's a plant in an ecosystem or a spider, or it doesn't matter who takes it, it allows that same kind of innovation to occur. That's its main function in the ecosystem. All species that take it experience it. They all have the same kind of neural networks we do. Ours came later. It was based on those patterns. So, yeah, of course that stuff's going to emerge, and I can see the same patterns emerging in the new generation now as happened back then. They're moving away from Christian dogmatism, away from reductionistic paradigms, away from kind of the paternalistic, militaristic dynamics in the government, and they're wanting to find other options. And I just want to live long enough to see the shit really hit the fan, because it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, radicals for probably centuries now have said, and they keep saying, another world is possible, right? And I think people are waking up and deciding that they want to build that world. They're tired of waiting for it.
Well, sure they are. And so I think that that's great, and that all of the people in your age group have the energy for it, and I think it's wonderful. So more power to you. I think it's wonderful.
I wanted to ask you, Stephen, earlier before the show, Pat and I were talking, going over, what we were going to talk about tonight. And we got on the subject of primitivism. Okay. If you're familiar with, are you familiar with John Zerzan at all?
Who?
John Zerzan.
No, it doesn't sound familiar.
Okay. It was kind of a founder of the primitivist movement, but yeah, we were just discussing. Do you have an opinion on primitivism?
Well, primitive, define it for me. I think I know what you mean, but just to make sure, define it for me.
It's essentially, almost. Some primitivists are extremely anti-technology, but it's kind of you could say, revolutionary movement in the sense that the true sense of the word. I mean, they want to return to old tribal structures and live an entirely naturalistic lifestyle without technological innovation. Usually, they talk about without even any kind of agriculture, organized agriculture.
Right. Well, that's kind of, I don't know if you know this, but the United States goes through that cycle about every 50 years, and it has been doing that since the first people showed up here, and it's a really common pattern in this culture. I don't know much about it in Europe, but the same dynamic seems to occur in England. I know that it has in France and in Spain. So that whole thing, the dynamic about that is, I think it's fascinating. I mean, when I left California, I moved up into the mountains and basically lived a very primitive lifestyle for quite a few years. And I liked it, because I find nature doesn't lie. It's like the rules are very clear. And nature is very honest, in my opinion. And so I found it much easier to do that and live that kind of life. And it really infused everything else I've done since then. So in a sense, I have a really kind of strange hybrid sort of life where it's a blend of that primitive dynamic that was very deeply ingrained in me with certain aspects of the technological dynamics of our culture. There's certain aspects that flow into it, and there's this weird hybrid. So you'll see in my books, for instance, the 5 medical herbals I've done on resistant bacteria and viruses and the whole stealth pathogen complex that includes the Lyme group. Fundamentally what I'm looking at is people using plant medicines that they can find wild in nature or grow in their yards, are already growing in their yards unbeknownst to them, and using that to treat illness. But I've combined that with this really sophisticated analysis of, for those 5 books, I probably read 15,000 journal papers and collated all of the data in there for that, because I'm wanting to be able to create this different kind of a healing structure that's not fundamentally based in the technological reductionist group, but yet when people begin to use plant medicines, they tend to be frightened of it because the reductive groups bash them so much and say, oh, there hasn't been safety studies and all this stuff, which is very much not true. And so then you get this sort of permission that begins to happen. I begin to use the reductive paradigm as a way to subvert the reductive paradigm and to open up this other channel. So to me, I think there's kind of this hybrid form of primitivism with a certain dynamic of technology that is a really useful way to inhabit the earth. It's just when the technology goes too far in that direction, it's just, look, really, those guys are crazy. that's all of Michael Crichton's books really were about that. Mm-hmm. Jurassic Park was about the hubris of scientists trying to, bring back extinct animals, and it was the Frankenstein story told over and over again, and
yeah.
But yet they still don't get it. They won't stop. So, that's the insane shadow side of the thing.
Right. I think Terrence, to bring him up again, Terrence McKenna had a really good way of sort of articulating it. He called it the archaic revival. And it was basically using the societal structures of prehistoric peoples and sort of melding them with the current cyber culture. And
well, in a way, that really makes sense. I mean, part of what we forget is that we are archaic peoples. I mean, we haven't stopped being that way. The ancient traditions of our human species are around us everywhere. They're not lost. They're just things that we don't perceive because of the software that we're given as we are raised and we go through school. That archaic dynamic is a fundamental part of all human beings. It's in our DNA structure. It can't be eradicated. So in that sense, just the whole concept of a primitive, superstitious past and the rational, technologically advanced human that exists now, I mean, it's not a realistic perspective. We still have those parts of us, and they're still in play much more powerfully than people realize.
Right. That's absolutely my thoughts on it also, and again, it's not, we're brought up to think of things, like you just said, in this black and white way, when the reality of the situation is, it's like, why? Why does it have to be black and white? Why can't we explore prior ways of doing things and mix them with what we have now? I mean, who wrote the rule that we can't do that?
But it's just a cultural preference, and because it makes people feel safer to think that the cultural frame that they're in is the ultimate reality. But I mean, if you really start looking at DNA, everybody pretty much knows, and they accept that DNA carries certain kind of memories, okay? They don't use that word, but that's what they really mean. It carries memories of eye color or hair color or all these different things. And so we have a very complicated genetic structure which is filled with information and memory from our ancestors that go back for thousands of years, and those memories can come out which can affect our form, our height, our eye color, our hair color, or whatever, right, our skin dynamics. But what people don't realize is that the genome is a flexible organ of the cell. It's a self-organized biological organism. It's a nested, self-organized organism within the multiple organisms that make up the human being. We're really a complex of nested self-organisms all working together as a single unit. We're not really an I, we're a multiplicity. But just looking at the DNA dynamic, the thing is, it not only carries memories of physiology, it carries memories of behavior that go back a long time. So you get literally communications from our ancestors, from immediate generations and thousands of generations ago that flow from that into us. And that's never really been explored or examined by the reductive technology groups and, the mechanicalistic scientists. But that's really what's accurate. And so these things flow into us all of the time. The Earth is a self-organized entity. It's been dealing with being self-organized for a very, very long time. It's not this passive entity that's just sitting there while, the patriarchy rapes it, because it can't do anything else. We're immersed in that scenario, and we're being changed and modulated in ways that our culture can't even remotely fathom. And it happens all the time. Life is a lot more interesting and fascinating and filled with awe than we're taught, or that most of us give credence for. I mean, it's a fascinating dynamic for me. I love being incarnate in the body. I love being alive on the earth. I love being an earth person. It's fascinating.
I think that we're at this point now where we need to sort of redefine the parameters of something like the scientific method now that we're gaining more understanding of the quote unquote chaotic nature of reality. Do you think that we're sort of limited by that current paradigm that science
Well,
is operating on?
the scientific paradigm, most people don't understand. It's going through a massive destructuring at this point.
Yeah.
And the old guard is holding on as hard as they can, but the new guard is just filled with a lot of energy, and they're really kicking some serious ass. And the whole thing is going through the same kind of change that happened to physics when Einstein and all of his pals showed up. The whole paradigm is being restructured. The big problem is that our industry and our culture here is based on that old paradigm.
Exactly.
And people's survival is hooked into it. Millions of people's survival is hooked into it. So as that whole thing begins to destabilize, it activates everybody's survival fears and drives. And so you end up with this tremendous cultural conflict. Paradigm shifts don't happen nicely. It's always a big mess. And so, that's what's happening. And on the other side, there's going to be a much more accurate understanding of the world that we're in. The problem is that, everything from the kind of laws that, the towns that we're in have about how you're supposed to build houses or do sewage systems or whatever, run electricity, all of that stuff from the tiniest level on up is all inaccurate. And so it's all going to have to be redone, and it's not going to be easy. It's going to be very, very difficult. But we are in the midst of this massive paradigm change that the Earth itself is forcing on us because we've really reached the limits of habitation. I mean, we've exceeded the carrying capacity of the Earth. There isn't any way around that. It's just flat out true. Most environmentalists won't say it because the implications are too upsetting, but nevertheless it's true. And that's what, in our time now, the next 50 years, that's what we're going to be dealing with. And there, as Dorian Sagan once put it, on Earth, there is no escape from ecological implications. There's just not.
Yeah, absolutely not. One of the things I find frustrating about the paradigm we're locked into now is this hierarchical, dogmatic system, right? So you have, the vanity of that scientific paradigm. You have organized religion, the states. I don't need the organized religion when I can practice my own spirituality within my community and with my family. I don't need the I don't need the medical industry if I can practice apothecary and use natural medicines. We can do these things without all these gateways.
Right,
and
I think that's crucially important. And every time those gateways are removed or else they don't exist, the degree of innovation that happens is phenomenal. I mean, the degree of innovation that's happened in herbal medicine over the last 30 years is absolutely incredible. And if the American culture finds a way to finally control it under the guise of safety and basically scaring the bejesus out of everybody and say, oh, we got to control this, otherwise you could die, which is the normal kind of, storyline that you get, innovation is just going to stop. Innovation in medicine, even though it doesn't seem like it, is extremely slow. And anybody that comes up with something that's outside of the accepted paradigm is absolutely fundamentally attacked. You can see that with Lyme disease now. It doesn't fit into the old bacterial, theoretical structure because stealth pathogens and the first generation bacteria like staph, they don't behave the same way. They're very different. And, the stealth pathogens do not respond well to antibiotics. And you have to have the kind of approach you need to actually heal them the technological medical structure is not capable of even thinking that way, much less implementing it. And so that's one of the front lines where you have the two different paradigms existing in absolute tremendous conflict. And you can see it many places, like plant neurobiology, where they're looking at that the plant brain, which is the root system, and it has synapses and neurons just like we do in our brain. Our neural network our neural tree is held inside our organ, the brain, but the neural network of plants, its neural tree is in the soil, so it can grow without any restrictions. So when you see an aspen root system that's over 100 years old that covers 100 acres, its neural network is magnitudes larger than a human being. It's much more intelligent. So, but when you start getting into the idea of plants being equal to or superior to the intelligence of human beings, the plant neurobiologists don't have trouble with that. But the older people, they have a lot of trouble with that. They have more trouble with that than they do the concept of bacterial intelligence. And so that's another edge on the front lines where the conflict is absolutely fundamental. The view of the world in plant neurobiology, or when you're working with stealth pathogens as an herbalist, it's not the same as the world viewpoint they have over there. You know, they belong to, you know, an outmoded orientation, but, you know, they're not going to give up their position very easily. But yeah, you take those barriers off, the innovation that occurs is absolutely incredible, and that's really the way out of the dilemma in which we find ourselves. It really is.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the removal of those barriers, what's so frustrating is, you hear about guys in their garage that build free energy machines. You know, I mean, this is all possible. It's just not possible within the paradigm that's been created for us. You know, going back to plant.
No, it's really not. I mean, and there's so many solutions people come up with for various things, and many of them are repressed because, like, for instance, there were some people in Colorado about 40 years ago. They created this absolutely phenomenal waste treatment system for houses. It was the size of a furnace that you would put in your home, and all of the wastewater from the house, brown and gray, went into that. It was completely recycled and redone. It was purer than the tap water that the city was putting out. And then you just had this little bag of powder you would take out, and then you could spread it on the garden or whatever. They wouldn't allow them to hook them up. They allowed a couple of test ones. Everything was fine. They wouldn't allow them to hook it up because they couldn't get their head around that they're drinking, shit water. So, I mean, they're like, no, I can't, that's too gross, I can't do that. But nevertheless, that technology was invented, just like the work that's being done, the edgy work that's being done in herbal medicines is so sophisticated now. Technological medicine in many ways begins to really pale in comparison to it, but yet this culture, unless you're outside of the medical establishment, you're not going to be very aware of it, and you're not going to have access to it. And there's, even within the herbal community, there's a very kind of conservative framework that doesn't really understand it. So it's we run into just because we're liberals doesn't mean that other members of our liberal tribe aren't conservative and hooked into the shadow in their own way. And it's a constant problem no matter where we go. The human propensity for reductionism, it's just the way it is. That's why drugs were invented. That's why psilocybin exists.
Sure, absolutely. It breaks down those rigid cultural boundaries. It's a catch-22 because it's like on one level we create culture, but then it's like that very culture that we create oftentimes just traps us and pulls us.
Yeah, it does. It becomes a straitjacket for a lot of us. And I mean, that's one of the brilliances of Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol story, his novel. Basically, Scrooge had a series of visionary experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at him in the beginning, he was this very conservative, reductive, closed-in, heart-closed human being. And at the end, he became very childlike again. That was the whole point of it. You look at Robert Louis Stevenson's story, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Mm-hmm.
The whole point of that story, it's just brilliant. It's that there's this guy, he's a good doctor. He only cares for the welfare of others, and he goes all around helping people. But late at night, there's this other part of him that only appears elsewhere in the city, and it's this kind of bestial, regressive part that causes all of this damage. I mean, it's one of the best metaphors for the shadow side of the good in that sense that I've ever read. That was why it's such a fundamental story. So those truths can't really be escaped, yet we constantly, try to, as a culture, forget that those are fundamental to who we are as human beings. So, when I was young, I spent a lot of time with my great-grandfather, who was originally a horse and buggy physician. He used mostly herbs in his practice for most of his life. And we were laying together on the banks of this pond one day and fishing, and he reached in and he gathered a handful of the water, and he leaned over to me and he goes, "Have you ever tasted this water?" And I said, "No." He goes, "It's really good here." And so it's the first time I ever remember tasting wild water.
Huh.
But, it wasn't too long before my mother caught me drinking wild water and told me it would kill me.
Yeah.
It began to instill in me a fear of the wildness of nature. And the journey back to wild water is a long one, but each one of us has to take it in our own way to find our way back. And that's really a lot of what we're talking about here tonight, is that journey back to wild water, that we unschool ourselves, that we rewild ourselves, and we become once again part of the scenario, just one intelligent organism amongst a multitude, and then we begin to find out what it is we're really meant to do here, and begin to do it, because there's no better living on the planet than that, than to know whenever you wake up in the morning you've done what you were meant to do, and at the end of life to have that knowledge that that's what you've done. And so that's what it's really about, the journey back to wild water.
That's fantastic. That's a fantastic story. That's a fantastic statement. And also, coincidentally, if you don't use Journey Back to Wild Water as a book title, I think I might steal that from you, Stephen.
Well, you're welcome to steal it. I mean, I've put it in some of my books that I've never used as a title.
No, yeah, that's just lovely. Honestly, I know that we're at our time too, and I think that's probably a great place to leave it. I really wish we weren't. I'd love to do this again, Stephen. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thanks. Well, sometime again in a few months, if you're inclined, give me another call and we'll do it again.
Absolutely. Why don't you tell people a little bit, well, first of all, give them the names of your books, your website, how to contact you.
The name of all 21 books. We've been here for a long time,
Well, just the ones you like the most.
But they can get on Amazon and just type in my name and they'll all come up. But
I actually have that page up right now. It is an extensive list of books. So.
Right. But, my website is GaianStudies.org, GAIA Studies.org, and they can find out more about me there, and, and they'll probably enjoy some of my books. And I'm sure if they read Plant Intelligence, it's absolutely guaranteed to irritate them at least once and inspire them many times.
Oh, that's the best kind of book. Stephen, it's been fantastic. Thanks a lot for joining us tonight.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on. Deeply appreciated.
All right, everyone. Well, those links will be in the information for this video. Also, you can check out more from us at Free Radical Media via Facebook and Twitter. That's facebook.com/freeradmedia, twitter.com/freeradmedia. And you can check out our website at freeradicalmedia.wordpress.com. Drop us a line. We're always eager to hear from you. Our thanks again to Stephen. My thanks, as always, to my co-host, Patrick Ryan. And that's it for us tonight, everybody. Thanks a lot. Free Radical Media Podcast.